The cemetery was a forgotten remnant of the past. The oldest headstones had been reduced to rubble, and newer ones, well over a century old, were falling victim to the wraths of time. A blanket of fog always hung over this place. Once a night every week, a handful of visitors ignored this omen because to them it wasn't an omen. The fog was the perfect atmosphere for their tales. They arrived with Lu, the only one in the group who drove, and headed to their spot in the cemetery where they always gathered. Quinn Chasey moved dead brush from where they made a small makeshift fire with stones, careful to pick rocks and not headstone rubble. To the best of their knowledge, there wasn't a caretaker who minded the place, but just in case, they were careful to cover their tracks. Once the rocks and sticks were set, Claire Wheatley lit the fire. It crackled and hissed and was only ever strong enough to just light their faces with a warm, pulsating orange glow. The cemetery was a perfect place for them. It was on the outskirts of town, quiet, and nobody ever bothered with it. They felt sad for those buried here, and decided to tell their weekly tales of horror to offer those buried beneath them some company. Z rubbed her hands together and held her open palms to the fire. "Whose turn is it?" "Mine," Quinn said flatly. Ig Cress was excited. "Oh, this'll be good. Is it that story you've been hinting about?" "No. That one's for another night. This one's just simple. Quinn just wanted to get it over with." Claire shrugged. "As long as it's scary. Sometimes simple is darker. This one is about being a prisoner in your own body, and the only way to communicate that there is a hint of you left is through art. To those who slumber beneath us, I submit the tale, drawn." Quinn started. Tabitha cleaned her 5-year-old son Stevie's disastrous room and came across more of his drawings. The first time he started drawing, he was 4. He picked up sidewalk chalk the neighborhood kids left behind and made the whole neighborhood nervous with the cryptic images he sketched out. Enough complaints later and Stevie was given markers to try inside. He dried the hell out of those every time she bought new ones, so needless to say, that expensive hobby turned into crayons. The drawings became more disturbing. Worried for her son, Tabby took away anything he could use to draw and draw on, so it made it all the more peculiar when she discovered his newest creations. These didn't look like his drawings. The TV was on, but Stevie's back was to it, as he opted for his favorite toys instead. Tabby sat on the couch beside him. She had a million other things to do today, including work later, but her autistic son always came first. She sat there as long as she could and watched him play in his own little world, afraid to bother him with questions about his drawings. She stood, rubbed the top of his head, and crossed the room, leaving his drawings on the couch by accident when she heard them shuffle. Stevie looked through the drawings, having abandoned his toys for the moment to thoughtfully peruse them. She couldn't tell if he recognized them or had never seen them before, and stood in the hall when Stevie turned to her and held a stack of art in one hand for her. She smiled. "Keep 'em, killer. Mama has to clean. Stay out of your room, please." Stevie nodded, and Tabby took to his room. Stevie was a good kid, despite what the neighbors thought. It took her all of 10 minutes to collect his clothes in the large white hamper she carried in. By the time she stood up, a sharp pain shot up her spine. The hamper basket dropped, nearly smashing her toes, and she stood there focusing on anything but the pain. The TV wasn't on. "Honey?" she called out. It moved into the living room and gasped. The artwork was scattered throughout the room. Stevie seemed oblivious to the mess, still playing with his toys. "Stevie, what happened? Who turned off the—" Tabby looked at Stevie's reflection in the TV. A figure stood right next to him that hurried past her, and she felt it. "The rabbit man," Stevie told her. "I don't have time to clean this up, baby." "It's going in my room." "Why is— who?" "The rabbit man." "What rabbit man, Stevie?" "He's mad at you." "Mad at me for what?" Stevie returned to his imaginary world, and Tabby returned to his room. The laundry basket was flipped over where she had left it. It looked like a clothes bomb detonated. Tabby rinsed off the stresses of the day in the shower. She closed her eyes and drifted off as the hot water massaged her shoulders. The water turned freezing cold and was pouring down like hard rain. It was a disturbing wake-up call that forced her to open her eyes. She stood on a short stone bridge. It was midday and freezing, and had been raining for days. All she could see around her was grass and trees as far as the eye could see, but even those were fogged from view. Beneath the bridge was a riverbed. On top of the bridge was a dark figure looming over the edge. Tabby approached them, but the closer she got, the more their crooked frame leaned forward and plummeted into the river below. Tabby looked over the bridge's edge. The rain fell so hard she couldn't see or breathe. Tabby snapped out of it, nearly suffocating herself in the water, and turned it off. She grabbed a towel and wiped her face. When she opened her eyes, her toes were covered in dirt. The following day she took Stevie to the park, but lost sight of him just a few minutes in, and hurried around the park until coming across the same bridge from her vision, except Stevie stood on its narrow stone ledge looking down at the same place where the figure had fallen. Tabby told him to step off the ledge, but he paid no attention. She started for him when he slipped and cracked his head against the ledge before plummeting to the riverbed. Tabby's every nerve was on fire. She ran for the ledge until she heard Stevie playing on the other side. She reprimanded him for having disappeared, but bear hugged the air out of him. Stevie was confused and frightened. Tabby tucked him in and found more drawings. They were getting more disturbing. She went to her room, set the drawings aside, and finally fell asleep. As exhausted as she was, Tabby tossed and turned and felt like she could sleep for days, but couldn't even get comfortable enough to sleep for a few minutes. She rolled over and faced the nightstand with Stevie's drawings. One was sticking out in her mind. She took it up and stared at it. It was a dark, towering figure with red eyes staring at her from the hall as it opened Stevie's door. Tabby peeked out of her room to look at Stevie's door. The picture was drawn from her perspective, and she aligned the picture with her doorway. It matched perfectly, except the door was closed. When she lowered the picture, his door was open. Tabby entered his room and turned the light on. Stevie was hiding under the covers, shaking. She pulled the sheet away and Stevie nearly had a panic attack. He would have called out to his mother had he been able to speak. He clung to her as she sat next to him. He was freezing. "You didn't check the bed for monsters!" he cried. "What happened, baby? You're freezing!" He didn't answer her. She had a weird thought. Was it the rabbit man? More tears fell down his face. She had never seen him so upset, and it scared even her. "I'll check, okay?" She went to put him down, but he wouldn't let go and clung to her like her own skin. "Honey, I'll be right here." Stevie shook his head. He tried to speak, but stuttered on silence. Tabby laid down with him and cuddled for a moment to ease him. His muscles were so tense they could snap. He finally dropped his arms and she replaced herself with his blanket. The fear in his eyes worsened. "Baby, what's the matter?" "Not the closet, please, Mama." "What's in the closet, sweetheart?" "Please, Mama." He cried even harder. She could tell his body was tensing again and gripping the blanket for dear life. "What's in the closet, Stevie?" He tried to spit out words, but it broke his heart that he couldn't. All he could do was stare at the closet door and grip his blanket with all his might. Stevie knew he couldn't stop his mom. She was going to check regardless, and he sure didn't want to be around when she did. The more he feared, the more she believed somebody else was in the room with them, and contemplated running for the phone, but leaving him alone wasn't an option. "Is there someone in the closet, honey?" She hoped he'd shake his head. He nodded, and her stomach dropped. Tabby started for the closet door, and the walk seemed to take forever. She reached for the doorknob and contemplated ripping the door open with a "aha!" And as she pondered the thought, staring at the doorknob turned, and the door opened and stopped on her hand. Her stomach felt like fire. Awful, fearful things swelled in her throat. She struggled for the right thoughts to translate into words and stuttered on the ones that came to mind. Is someone in there?" It was the last question she wanted to ask, but it was all she could think of saying. "Yes," something hissed from behind the door. It wasn't human. Tabby backed away from the closet and hit the bed. "Stevie, honey, you're coming with me, oh." Stevie was quiet. Tabby turned and Stevie was standing on the bed with the blanket over him. "Kay?" she finished. A whimper came from under the bed. She checked for monsters, only to find Stevie was curled up into a ball with his PJs, colorless and petrified. "Baby, what are you—" She stopped herself, wondering what the hell was on the bed when— "It's on my bed, Mama," Stevie whispered as softly as he could, shaking to the bone. Tabby looked up at the blanketed figure and reached out for Stevie, keeping a sharp eye on the room when something cold and wet grabbed her wrist and yanked her under the bed. Tabby woke with a deep, violent gasp and a throbbing headache that split her skull. Her entire body felt stiff and numb. She stormed Stevie's room, uppercutting the light switch, and ripped open the closet door. Stevie jumped. When he realized it was his mom, he calmed, but looked worn out. "Mama?" Satisfied but unsatisfied, Tabby checked underneath the bed. Aside from some hidden laundry Stevie tried to hide along with some toys he probably forgot he hid, there weren't any monsters. "It's okay, sweetie. Go back to bed." Tabby felt bad. She scared Stevie half to death. She tucked him in, and the nightmares she had replayed in her mind. It was enough to lay down with him again and hold him close. The light was on, but after what she had seen, it was more than welcome. Tabby rested on his pillow, seconds from sleep when the crunching of papers crackled underneath her. She sat up and lifted the pillows to find a handful of drawings. These were the most disturbing she had seen yet. And the first, she was resting on the bed with her son. They were surrounded by shadows with dark eyes waiting for them to fall asleep. They came from the closet, and there were more where they came from, with the distinct impression of a rabbit-looking creature watching them. Her eyes gravitated towards the closet in his room, and that sense of dread caught up again. Tabby stared at the closet, half expecting it to open again, as it did in her nightmare. The room light flickered, and she could briefly see the shadows in the picture towering over them. She had a curious feeling and began thumbing through the pictures, and they played out like a flip book. The shadows surrounded the bed before scattering for the rabbit man. Stevie was gone. She took the pictures and ripped them to shreds. "Leave us alone!" Stevie grabbed her arm and stared at the pictures ripped by his mother. She had never seen his eyes so wide with terror before. Tabby could feel the color drain from her skin with the way he looked at her, even after she thought she had finally gotten a handle on the situation. That look in his eyes. Jesus. She looked at the shredded pictures, feeling like she made it terribly and irreversibly worse. "You let them out!" Stevie choked. "That's it?" Z was disappointed. "That's it," Quinn concluded, and went to put out the fire when Ig stopped her. "That's a cliffhanger of a story with no conclusion." Ig was irritated, almost ashamed Quinn wasn't trying. "That's the point." Quinn was ready to move on with her night. "Finish the story," Claire demanded. Quinn ignored her, and instead stared into the fire. "What say you all? Is it time, or should I conclude the story?" Quinn demanded a vote. Each member voted. "Conclude." "I literally have nothing to add to it, though," Quinn admitted. "I like cliffhangers." "Can I take a crack at it? I may have something." Claire smiled. Quinn vaguely grinned. "Sure." Claire dove in. It wasn't long before the evils Tabitha released made their presence known without having to hide in the shadows. "Wait!" Z paused Claire. Quinn looked deeply concerned. "Is everything okay, Quinn?" Quinn took a moment and softly exhaled. "No, everything's not okay." "Talk to us." Claire tried to be delicate. "I've been too preoccupied to think of a story. The one I told you isn't..." Quinn weighed her words carefully. "It's real." "You ended it where it's at?" Ig's jaw dropped. "Now we're talking!" Z glanced disapprovingly at Ig. Ig apologized. "Sorry, this just makes it that much darker." "Do you need our help?" Z asked. the sound of someone approaching as leaves crunched and twigs snapped. "They're here," Quinn announced. The group looked around, eyes wide, until Tabitha and Stevie appeared from the shadows. "I asked them to be here tonight. I wanted them to tell the rest of the story." Quinn stood and approached Tabitha. She hugged both of them and offered them a seat at the fire. The group went from being excited for the story to scared, and exchanged glances at one another. Quinn sat next to Tabitha. "Whenever you're ready." Tabitha was incredibly shy. I'm Tabitha. This is my son Stevie. I asked Quinn to tell our story." She looked at Quinn. "It's gotten worse. A lot worse." Tabitha cooks Stevie eggs. Her son sits at the table watching the TV in the other room. She sets his breakfast down in front of him, and before he can dig in, the plate is thrown into the wall. The table moved towards Stevie. "Come here, honey." She went to grab his hand, but the table slid across the floor. She picked him up and the table crashed into his chair, pinning it to the wall. She hurried down the hall and attempted to go into her room, but all the doors opened and slammed shut. She moved into the living room, but pictures flew off the walls, narrowly avoiding them. The walls and ceilings cracked. Tabitha held Stevie tight and screamed at the top of her lungs for it to stop. The door was slightly open. Quinn entered. Tabitha sat on the couch with Stevie. They looked exhausted. The place was a mess. "Tab?" Quinn's voice shook as she stood still just a few feet from the couch. Tabitha's face was red. She'd been crying. Stevie, emotionally and physically worn out, was asleep in his mother's arms. Quinn looked to the TV. A human-like rabbit figure stood in the static. There was no volume, but the figure watched all of them. "What do you want?" Quinn asked and received no response. "Have you tried turning it off?" she asked Tabitha. "It is off," Tabitha told her, out of ideas and nearly having accepted defeat. Quinn opened the door and stood next to it, holding it to the wall and motioned for Tabitha to bring Stevie when something threw her across the room and slammed the door. The TV static went away. Rabbit Man was gone. "What's going on?" Quinn needed answers. "I've always thought he was autistic. When he started drawing, I thought he was troubled. These things have been haunting him and using him to get released. I messed up, Quinn. But why do they hang around?" The thought haunted Tabitha. "What are you talking about?" Quinn wasn't any closer to understanding any of it. "He drew terrifying pictures. Things started happening. I ripped them to shreds thinking it would end it, but it just got worse. Wouldn't you think?" Tabitha zoned out. She was miles away in deep thought. "Tab?" Quinn tried to bring her back. "Sit with Stevie, would you?" Tabitha and Quinn changed places. Tabitha hurried away, only to return a few moments later with a handful of Stevie's drawings and tried to realign the torn drawings. She laid them out on the floor like a puzzle until every drawing connected with the next, and told the story that only all of them in the right order could tell. "I didn't release them," Tabitha said to herself, finally seeing the bigger picture. Quinn stared at the drawings. It's the first time she's seeing them. They're disturbing, but the bigger picture is lost on her. Neither did Stevie. She looked at her son with a look that dropped Quinn's stomach. He's creating them. Back at the cemetery, the group listened intently to Tabitha. I realized that they were his fears, except he didn't have to be asleep for them to be real. Whether he stopped drawing or not, if he thought of them, they would always exist. When I tore his drawings, it upset him. He thought they were real, so everything that happened was what he imagined would. The story has no ending, I'm afraid, but that is the story so far. I can't believe it's real. Ig was in awe. I think that'll do for tonight. Z motioned for the group to conclude their night. Claire put out the fire that was already crackling embers. Quinn covered it with the same brush from earlier. As they headed for Z's car on their way home, none were aware of the silhouette of the rabbit man watching them from the campfire as they left.